You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Haristodoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Haristodoulou, and welcome to my 2023 USFL season in review. I will be diving into the championship game that happened this past Saturday, giving my thoughts and opinions on the entirety of the game. And then, of course, we're going to take a look back at the entirety of the USFL season, share some of my thoughts and opinions on it, and then look forward towards the offseason and kind of what I have planned regarding the USFL as we roll through what's going to end up being a little bit more of a quiet time, because the USFL is not like, you know, the big leagues or professional leagues, I guess you should say, of like the NFL or the NBA and things like that, where even during the offseason, there's a lot of news going on regarding things get a little bit more quiet for these spring football leagues. And I'm sure for some of you that maybe watch the XFL are probably experiencing some of that as well. Yes, you'll have a piece of news here or there drop out, but it's not quite as noisy as some of the other professional leagues that we get to watch all year round. So without further ado, few things, comment down below. Thoughts and opinions on the championship game. Give me your thoughts and opinions on this past season as well. Some things you took away, some things you might want to see get improved, all of that. And let's dive right into it, beginning with the championship game from this past weekend as the Birmingham Stallions becoming back-to-back champions, winning 28-12 over the Pittsburgh Maulers. This game kind of encapsulated what they have been doing for the majority of the season, minus like a little bit of a hiccup and road bump that they went through in the earlier portion of the season. This game, even though it was close, it never really felt like the Stallions were ever not really in control. Even during like that big fumble return where it felt like the Maulers might storm back, it always kind of felt like the Stallions were they were a little bit ahead of the Maulers, even when the game was tight going into halftime. And in large part, it just has to do with the talent, the depth, and just the leaders of this team altogether. Alex Magoo capped off his MVP season with another remarkable performance in the most Alex Magoo of 2023 fashion he possibly could have. 307 yards total on the game, and then he had the 4 touchdown passes as well. 3 of those passes going to wide receiver Deon Cain, who ultimately ended up winning the USFL MVP award for the game. I've got to say, Deon Cain is somebody that I'm a big fan of, and somebody who I know a little bit more about just because I am a Colts fan, and he was on the Colts roster for a year, and I was somebody that actually was really hoping to see come on strong is because he was a talent in Clemson, and I was really hoping for him to kind of be like a diamond in the rough find for them. So to see him come into the USFL this year and dominate the way he did towards the back half of the season and really start to shine when it was just the kickoff returns, but then really late into the season, I feel like quietly, because you had, you know, the Davian Davis fiasco from a couple of weeks ago where, you know, he wasn't named on the USFL team, all USFL team, and then ultimately making a big statement last week. And then you have Jay Sternberger as well. There's just some other guys that I felt like were really kind of taking the spotlight away. But when the lights were shining brightest, Deon Cain came through when it mattered most, putting up 3 massive scores for the Stallions in that victory. So hats off to him for that MVP award for the game. Much deserved on him. And then the defensive side of things. I mean, what can you say? They adopted a more bend but don't break approach. I feel like the defense dealt with a lot of injuries this year, and so they weren't quite as aggressive or as good as they were last season, but ultimately that bend but don't break approach was a perfect game plan to have against a team that in the Pittsburgh Maulers just have struggled all year long to find their way into the end zone, and it proved to be very successful for the Stallions in holding them off. And switching gears and looking at the Maulers, since we're discussing that, a team that lived and died by the field goal, and ultimately in the biggest game died by the field goal. 4 field goals made to total up the entire 12 points that they had. I've got to say, offensively, just it's really disappointing, but not too surprising, the outcome that we got. This was along the lines of what I expected. Granted, my score line of 30-20, a little bit off. I gave the Maulers a little more credit on the offense, expecting them to maybe find a touchdown at least during this game here, but ultimately two big things that plagued them all season long are kind of what cost them here. The inability to protect Troy Williams, allowing 6 sacks on the day total. And then on top of that, like we mentioned, just not being able to finish off drives. And I feel like they weren't aggressive enough. I understand, Ray Horton was kind of off the wall about, the officiating, I guess we should just say to keep it simple, late in the game. And it felt like he could not really get over that towards the final few minutes there. But beyond that, the inability to score those touchdowns, the unwillingness to go for it in some of those 4th down situations. I would have thought that with the season on the line, you'd just be more willing to be aggressive and try to go for 6 as opposed to just settling for 3. So you live and die by the field goals. Your offensive line continues to be the problem that it had been all season long. And I feel like if there's anything you can't win with in any sort of football situation, it is a poor offensive line. And that really kind of reared its ugly head in this game here. And as for that fumble return, because I have to talk about that, that was a moment in the game where I thought we might see some sort of crazy comeback. And I saw a little bit of confusion about the penalty and it being called back. It's simple as it's an illegal forward handoff. You can't, if you are not the quarterback in that situation, hand the football off in front of you. And obviously they were running down the field. Lineman hands it off to the defensive back, and he ends up taking it to the house. It's unfortunate because I felt like that was the little bit of life that this team needed to really potentially steal this game away. And for that to be the case, it was as simple as, if he had just handed the ball off behind him instead of in front of him, we could be talking a very different outcome for the finish of the game. But ultimately, it was a fun game to watch. Very exciting. It had a lot of drama. It had some heated tempers during the game. And the USFL Championship last year, obviously a little bit more of a higher scoring affair. So if you like offensive football, maybe it was more for you. But this game really felt big. It felt like there was dramatic moments where, could the Stallions defense kind of pin the Maulers offense into that offensive hole that they've kind of been in all year long for the entirety of the 4 quarters. And the last time these two teams played, the Maulers played them close, 24-20, and they gave Alex Magoo probably his worst game of the season. So there was a lot of conversation going into this one here, but ultimately Stallions are back-to-back champions. Hats off to them. Unbelievable season for them, and they're in the midst of building a dynasty at this point here for the USFL. They're the team to beat, and there is a clear gap between not only the starting talent, but even the depth of this roster for the Stallions compared to everyone else in the USFL that needs to be closed this offseason if we want to see anyone else besides the Stallions hoisting the championship again next season. Now, beyond the championship game, I wanted to take some time and kind of put this season in a perspective and just talk about some of the things that I took away from this year, some of the highlights that I really enjoyed, and maybe even a low light or two. But I really want to focus on the good here for the USL because there was a lot of things going into this season that I was hoping to see and I ended up seeing, and I'm really happy with that. There's other things that, and especially based off some of the things Daryl Johnson said this weekend as well, that it's not quite what I was hoping to hear, but kind of like expected. And I'll get into that later on in a different video, but I'm going to just kind of focus on some of the big takeaways for me this year. And I think you can highlight this season in about 3 different ways. The first one being the quality of play that we saw. On top of that, the parity within the league altogether. And I have the locations highlighted as well, and we'll talk about that last when we get to it. But starting with just the quality of play. Talk about a drastic improvement from what we saw last year. It was very clear that last season was the first season reboot of the USFL. It felt like teams were somewhat discombobulated offensively for like the first half of the season, and maybe even then some for some of the teams. Like when you look at the Maulers last year, you might look at the offense this year and be like, man, they just couldn't get into the end zone. Well, I mean, it felt like last year sometimes the Maulers just couldn't even figure out how to field an offense some weeks. So overall, we saw a much drastic improvement of play, and we maybe had a feel out process within the first like 2 or 3 weeks or so, but by the time week 4 hit, it was any man's game. There were upsets after upsets, week in and week out. And I remember sitting here around like week 5 or 6, saying to myself as I'm going over like power rankings and just kind of breaking stuff down and trying to make picks for games the following weeks, I'm sitting here thinking, Do I really know what's going on here as well as I think I do? And it really just boiled down to it was any man's games some of these weeks. And that's what I was really, really hoping for. And I talked about a lot during my wish list video last year. And then in the lead up to the actual start of the season, I wanted parity and we got it. That was the biggest thing on my wish list. And the quality of play is a big part of that as well. Everyone came to play and you saw some more talent come in. Reuben Foster was massive for the Maulers. I'm very happy with what we saw there. And then on the topic of parity, as I just mentioned, you want to talk about just again, any man's game, and it was any man's playoff spot all the way to the very end. Last year, it felt like we pretty much knew who was going to make it to the playoffs come season's end. The Panthers were really struggling. The Maulers were really struggling. The Gamblers were really struggling as well. There was just not a lot of surprise coming towards the end of the season as to who was going to be in the playoffs. And yeah, there was maybe like, who's the number 1 seed, who's the number 2 seed, but in a situation where all the playoffs were just held in Canton, it didn't really even matter. But when you look at this season, we're going into week 10. Every single team, even the Showboats, although mathematically speaking, it was nearly impossible, everyone was in the running for a playoff spot if the dominoes fell in their favor. And that was another thing that I was really hoping to see for this season, was the gap being closed amongst some of the bottom teams and things just being exciting. And that's exactly what we got. On top of that, when you think back to, I think it was like maybe it was like 6 or 7. I don't remember the exact week, but everyone was talking about the standings. And when you went down the list here, every single team within their division was 2-2, and it was anyone's ball game. And yes, you look at, the South being maybe a little bit stronger than the North actually was. And sure, that is definitely an argument there, but there were strengths to the North that were clear weaknesses within the South. I would definitely look at the defenses of the North as a far formidable group than the defenses of the South. The South just had a lot more talent on the offensive side of the ball, and we were seeing a lot more production from that end, but I would take probably the North's defenses over the South's defenses, if I'm just kind of throwing it off the top of my head. Could be wrong on that. I didn't really look at it, but just like gun to my head, if somebody just asked me on the spot, there was a lot to like about the defenses in the North. And if there weren't some of the offensive issues that we saw them deal with this year, I think record-wise, you could take a few wins away from the South and pass them over to the North, and we're talking a much different situation here. But between quality of play and parity, I'm very happy with the way Season 2 came out. And then the locations. Let's talk about that for a second, because we went from a single hub system to 4 locations this year, where Canton held the playoffs last year, but ultimately every single game was played in Birmingham. And I could not be happier with the selections that they made. Giving Canton weekly games to watch and view for them after being the hosts for the playoffs last year, I think was perfect. They were already a location your league is familiar with, the fans are familiar with. Why not play games there a few times during the season? Then you look at them getting a spot in Detroit at the Lions Stadium there, Ford Field. That was huge for Michigan. And then on top of that, we lost the Tampa Bay Bandits, but then we gained the Memphis Showboats. And I've got to say, I'm not really unhappy with any of the decisions they made. I think each and every single choice that they made in this second season was perfect. Memphis clearly wants a football team, and they were all in on the Showboats from start to finish during that 0-3 run where it just felt like they might be dead in the water, and you had Todd Haley arguing with coaches post-game, and I was one of those people sitting there like, this is falling apart right before our eyes and not what we wanted from a first-year team that's coming in, and there was a lot of hype with the Memphis Showboats coming into this year. But then they turned things around. They're 5-3, fighting all their way into the potential spot into the playoffs. That was perfect for Memphis to come in like that and have that type of season. And then you look at Detroit. They deserve a much better Michigan Panthers team, and I think offensively with E.J. Perry, if he's back next year, we might end up seeing that. They deserve a better Panthers team. That is another location. Excellent fans, and I don't want to rag on the Detroit Lions because I am very excited to see what they do in the NFL this season, but they have not been the most successful franchise at times, and they deserve a good football team, and it pained me that it took up until the very last home game for Michigan to get a win in front of their fans. But I was happy for them to get that win. I was happy to see that fans were still filling the stands despite the record they had at home. Another location that I think they were spot on in getting into as soon as possible. And then you look at Canton. Obviously, I love the playoff feel there. I think they're a fantastic host for the championship game as well, but I think it's about time Canton gets themselves a team. And we'll talk more in detail about who I think needs to move to Canton, but for it being the Tom Benson Hall of Fame Stadium, football kind of just lives and breathes in that town. There is a team that I have in mind. Again, and we'll talk about that in a later video, but there is a team that I think could move right into Canton and have that entire place right behind them. So overall, excellent choices with locations. Do I want to see more locations for next season? Absolutely. That is, again, another discussion point, but I think they hit on all 4 places. Obviously, you're going to be in Birmingham, but choosing to go into Detroit, moving, or I guess having the Bandits kind of, take a year off so you could move yourself into Memphis and get a place that clearly wants a football team. All of it was hits. All of it. I don't think you could have really done any better. Obviously, getting more teams in home locations would have been great, but the success you saw with the draw of fans at both Detroit and Memphis, I think they justified the decisions that were made in terms of getting into those areas now as opposed to later, maybe going with other locations first before getting there. Very happy with what they did this season. But overall, I'm really excited. Again, we're focusing mainly on the positives here. I want this to be a positive video. I can give constructive criticism about things at a later date, but I'm still riding the high of the championship in the end of the season, so I want this to just be overall positive. I'm not going to sit here and act like there aren't things that I didn't like or there aren't negative things to take away from this past season. There definitely are. You can't sit here and say that the USFL Season 2 or the USFL up to this point has been perfect. There are things that I think they could do better, and we'll, again, get into that later on down the road. But finally, to wrap up this video, and I'll send you guys off for the rest of the day, we are going to talk my plans for the USFL's offseason. Now, I'll address this first because I feel like it is something that is worth mentioning. For those of you that found me during this USFL season here specifically, I didn't really cover anything regarding the USFL from the end of the season beyond like a wish list that I did up until the Showboats got announced as a new team within the league and that the Tampa Bay Bandits were folding at least for the season. So I don't want that to be the case this time around. Last season when I got into the USFL, it was kind of just like something for me to dive into and basically kind of cut my teeth in. My channel was still very young at the time, and I was still trying to figure out how I wanted to do content. And with the NFL's offseason and the NFL being what was initially the main source of my channel's content, there was obviously a lot of just me experimenting with it as it was an experimental league. And also I love the history about it. So it was really something fun for me to jump into. Now that the USFL has really become a staple of my channel, I want it to feel that way, not only during the season, but during the off season. So my goal as we roll through this off season here, and I've been planning ahead of time so I'm not just kind of scrambling for ideas once the season ended, is to try and get at least one USFL related piece of content out for you all each and every single week. Depending on just the news cycle and what's going on with the league and things that are being said or not said, whatever it may be, that may not be possible. So at the worst, I'm hoping every other week. I will say this, though. For at least the next couple of months, I will have something to come out each and every single week. Like I said, I planned ahead, and I set myself up to at least have some stuff going on for the next couple of months where we'll take a look at my wish list for 2024. And again, Daryl Johnston talked a lot this weekend during the USFL Championships lead up about things that we can expect to see for next season, just kind of plans and how they look, going forward for the next year or two. So that'll be stuff that's considered in that wish list and kind of what I want to see from the league heading into year number 3. But then once I get that out, I'm going to have a 8-part series where I dive into each and every single USFL team, and I will go over how they did this season, where I think they need to improve going into next season, and maybe players I expect to step up and become a larger piece of their respective teams. So I do have that planned out, and that should carry me through at least the next couple of months. My hope is that during these couple of months, as I'm doing that, some other things can come up. I might have some other ideas that kind of get sparked up, but I do cover a lot of NFL stuff, so I'm not going anywhere during this USFL offseason. If some of you watch the NFL, I will be here all NFL season long in conjunction with covering the USFL during their offseason. And on top of that, I would love to open up the comments to you all about just recommendations, things that maybe you want to see me talk about, things that you have interest in that you want to see maybe discussed on here. I'm also more than open for that. You fire away in the comment section down below. I am open to considering anything. If it's a good idea, I would be more than happy to run with it. But that's kind of how I'm looking at the offseason for now. So just know we're going to get at least 2 months of USFL content right off the bat. Every single week, I'll have at least one video out for you for at least the next 9 weeks. The next USFL piece of content you can expect from me will be next week. But other than that, that is it for me. I appreciate you for joining me along during the second USFL season. I hope you hang around for the off season. I hope you join in on the NFL season fun as well. But that is it for me. I will see you all next time. Appreciate you if you made it to the end of the video. Have a good one.